obviously, me and Dave Smith are going to disagree on the unprovoked part, but like, unprovoked invasion. I come in and take half your house and then say, why won't you negotiate peace with me? I don't agree with that. I think Russia would probably be invading more countries if NATO disbanded. But anyway, because NATO was invading, or Russia was invading countries prior to NATO expanding in 1999. Anyway, all I'm saying is, in general, the U.S. tends to have a freer press than Russia, and when we have press restrictions, they tend to be in a different way than Russia. Russian. You've just been in this Western media bubble for too long. Bro, manufacturing consent. I've read this book. I read the thing. Look, it's highlighted. I read it. I read manufacturing consent. I watched it. State and Revolution. I've read this, bro. I read Lenin. I haven't read this one. Hold on. I haven't read it. Targeting Iran. Retargeting Iran. Two other Chomsky books, okay? This is this Western bubble to you. This is a Western bubble. Vaush is like one of the few leftists that is pro-Ukraine and anti-Houthis, okay? He's one of the few leftists with good foreign policy takes. You may watch horse porn, but you know what? I'll say it. I would rather somebody watch horse porn than somebody be pro-Houthis and anti-Ukraine, okay? I'll say it. That's a trade-off I'm willing to make, okay? I'll say it. You heard it here. I don't care if you watch horse porn or short-stack goblin porn. As long as you're pro-Ukraine and anti-Houthis, okay?
This war, they're not going to drive Russia out of Crimea. They're not going to drive Russia out of many of the territories that they've taken right now. We should be working toward a deal, a peaceful solution, which has been on the table several times throughout this war, and it's been the West who has been trying to squash it.
Ukraine hasn't been losing. Both countries have been stalling. I don't want this conflict to end in a way that's going to guarantee the conflict reemerges in 2 years. If the line just freezes where it is right now, are we not guaranteeing another conflict in a few years?
The United States of America holds all of the chips. We could offer Vladimir Putin something that would probably get him to do whatever we wanted him to do. And you know what that is, the ultimate crowning jewel for him. How about we leave NATO?
He thinks we should offer to leave NATO in exchange for the end of the war in Ukraine.
All right.
Okay, that's an interesting take.
Welcome to Counterpoints. Today, we're going to be talking about the Ukraine-Russia war. Emily, who are we going to have?
Yeah, well, we have two great guests joining us. We're joined by YouTuber, live streamer Vaush, and we are joined by comedian, podcast host Dave Smith. Vaush, Dave, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Comedians, putting it nicely.
Thanks for having us.
Well, Ukraine is a timely subject to debate right now. Obviously, we're 2+ years into the war, but there have been recent escalations, and that makes it important, I think, to sort of go through some of those recent developments. For example, the U.S. recently greenlit, as many people know, strikes with U.S. weapons inside of Russia. There was the strike that Russia is blaming the U.S. for in Crimea just over the last couple of days. So
oh, wait, was this the one on the beach that killed a lot of civilians? Because that attack wasn't based, but it probably was not intentionally done by Ukraine.
I think probably a good way to begin is to give you both kind of an opening statement here. And I'll start with you, Vaush. Should the U.S. continue funding this war? And then we'll go to Dave on the same question. But go ahead first, Vaush.
Yeah, I mean, I don't like the idea on a systemic level of rewarding Russia for invading a neighbor. I just think, generally speaking, that's bad for global relations, very destabilizing. I think it's important.
Dave Smith is Jewish, but the last name really isn't a Jewish name. Thank you for the intelligent and relevant commentary, dude. Thank you. You needed to say that. I'm so glad that you said that.
We support any system that prevents that from happening, and not exactly a novel position. With regards to the recent development and strikes inside Russian territory, I actually think that this is, in the long run, going to be a good move for peace, just because the previous U.S. doctrine, which seemed to be provide just enough weapons to stall the war, but not like decisively conclude it, I think that was actually like the worst possible decision. You know, if Russia did sort of like early conquest, or if Ukraine decisively held its territory, those both end the war relatively quickly. But just impermanently stalling it right at the river, you know, I don't think that would have been good in the long run. Hopefully, these increased attacks inside Russian territory, mostly, of course, the refineries that they're using to sort of gin up their war economy. Hopefully that serves as an effective long-term deterrent. I don't want this conflict to continue. I don't want civilians to die. Yeah, I mean, obviously we'll have to see how things play out.
Dave, go ahead.
Well, of course, we should stop funding this. We never should have been funding this war to begin with. I think that in the original Cold War, which I still regard as one of the worst U.S. policies in modern American history that did so much to ruin our country, and not to mention, you know, like things like the Vietnam War and the millions of people who died in it. But at least in the original Cold War, I think there was always a healthy respect for the risks involved, and that all of us should, all sane people should recognize that the greatest priority in human history is that the United States of America and Russia do not go to war. And this was something that people in the old Cold War were very respectful of.
Listen, Russia ain't the USSR anymore, buddy. Russia ain't the threat it used to be. Hate to break it to you.
Of and aware of. The
I
difference
mean, they do have nuclear weapons, obviously.
in this new Cold War environment is that no one in the upper echelons of power in America seems to have any respect for this threat. And any respect for, you could think to yourself, well, maybe this will work out in a positive way that the US is greenlighting attacks inside of Russia. Or perhaps it could be an absolute disaster. And we're playing with, when I say we're playing with fire, it's an understatement. We're flirting with potentially the most disastrous thing that could happen to the human species. If America is to have any role in this conflict, it should be working toward a peaceful negotiation. And in fact, the American role and the Western role has been to kill peaceful negotiations from the beginning of this war and to prolong the fighting. I think that, as John Mearsheimer said back in 2014, the West is leading Ukraine down the primrose path has turned out to be the most accurate prediction on this entire conflict. And essentially, I think since—
Thank you, John Mearsheimer, quoter, variant 5000. I love when people quote him nonstop all the time. I always hate the framing of this, like when people say, oh, the US is squashing peace deals or whatever. Yeah, like it's just a fucking... obviously, me and Dave Smith are going to disagree on the unprovoked part, but like unprovoked invasion, I come in and take half your house and then say, why won't you negotiate peace with me? Like that. Well, that's also the analogy people use for Israel Palestine, but it's obviously harder there because of a bunch of different fucking reasons. Yeah, it's just such a dishonest framing.
The fall of the Soviet Union, American foreign policy.
Or not, I don't want to call it a dishonest framing. It's a stupid framing because there's no good reason that we should negotiate peace with someone who just who unprovokedly invaded another sovereign nation. Especially that peace deal would require giving up Ukrainian sovereignty over Ukrainian sovereign territory.
And just keep in mind, American foreign policy in the Clinton administration and in the W. Bush administration and Obama's administration, these are the same people who are in charge of the Middle East. And in fact, the neoconservatives were very focused on NATO expansion back in the 90s. You can go read the Project for a New American Century documents. And the same people who totally blundered foreign policy in the Middle East have totally blundered foreign policy in Europe, provoking Vladimir Putin and the Russians at every turn, leading to this awful place that we're in. That is certainly, if you care about the Ukrainians at all, has been more of a disaster for the Ukrainian people than anyone else.
And Dave, Vaush made a point that I think you hear a lot from defenders of U.S. support for the Ukrainian war, and that is you can't allow other countries, you can't reward other countries for invading other countries. You just can't do that. We can't have that. What's the response to that? We can't have that argument.
Well, I mean, first, I would just point out how absurd it is that after the last 20 years of terror wars, somehow the United States of America still gets to put itself in the position of global peacemaker, as if our major concern is that bigger nations can bully smaller nations. I mean, over the last 20 years, there's been no greater purveyor of violence than the United States of America, who has imposed its will on tiny, helpless nations across the world. As far as that, yeah, it's not good that Vladimir Putin
Vaush probably even agrees with this.
Ukraine, and yes, certainly that's something we don't want to see. My argument would be that America and the West more broadly had many opportunities, many off-ramps to put this fire out or at least calm it down. And at every single turn,
do not have sexual relations with that goblin. True. Thank you, Chiller Whale.
Poured more gasoline on this fire that ultimately resulted in the invasion in 2022.
Yeah, so Vaush, how can the U.S. say with a straight face that it's not okay for other countries to invade smaller countries?
Well, I think it's kind of a cowardly non-argument because I'm not arguing in favor of the moral superiority of the United States. That'd be a ridiculous position for me to take. It's not football. We're not taking sides like, waving banners. There are two levels to this when it comes to agency. We're concerned about the broader socioeconomic and geopolitical context that led to where we are now. And that goes back to the Cold War and even earlier. If we listen to Putin's justifications for the invasion, it goes back to the borders of the Russian Empire, and then there's like the immediate decision making. We mustn't remove agency from the equation. Russia invaded, by Putin's own words, in a sort of territorial land grab. The idea that it was entirely because of response to Western aggression or NATO posturing is ridiculous and ahistorical. But that doesn't mean the West isn't responsible for helping to create the situation we're in now. We have to balance these two justifications. Our arrogance after the end of the Cold War, the fact that rather than reaching out to Russia as a potential future ally, we ostracized, with the shock therapy, the sort of economic devastation of Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states. These contributed to an environment in which future conflict was inevitable. It was reprehensible on the part of the Western governments to participate in this.
Watch earlier today, Vaush got bodied? Really? By Dave Smith?
Look today at the divide between former West and Eastern Germany. I mean, the reason that East Germany is voting so heavily for the AfD is in large part because they see it as a rejection.
Ryan Affleck and him on the left, Cuba. From the left on Cuba was hilarious. Why were they talking about Cuba? Well, were they talking about the recent submarines that Russia sent to Cuba, and then the submarines the U.S. Left fucking falling apart? Dude, those submarines literally went to Cuba and fucking left in pieces. What a good threat. Russia, submarine, Cuba, left. Falling apart. Wasn't applied to Cuba was a Soviet expansion project. Realizing I disagree with both these people. Oh, well, Vaush is Vaush. At least he's pro-Ukraine. At least he's pro-Ukraine. listen, listen. Take what you can get from a leftist, okay? Take what you can get. He's pro funding Ukraine. I think he's completely wrong in the point that like shock therapy, to some extent, shock therapy. Jesus, I can't fucking speak. Shock therapy did lead to the rise of Putin, which it eventually did lead to the invasion of Ukraine. But Vaush is a State Department apologist. True. Who cares about Ukraine? Only Israel matters. True.
Of the doctrine of the West that left them behind after reunification. These should all be taken into account. And we must acknowledge that Putin is a fascist who did a territorial land grab. Those two facts don't contradict each other. They work together to create a complete narrative. With regards to the invasion now, I agree we have to take the threat from Russia seriously. And by that I mean we don't want this to scale out infinitely. We don't want this to turn into a global war. That's something we have to take seriously. At the same time, we have to acknowledge Russia does too. And their constant threats of nuclear war, the fact that they started this invasion, the fact that they have been posturing and acting aggressive towards Finland, towards the Baltic states, even like ramping up aggression towards the rest of Western Europe, we must consider again their agency. Now, I think that in the long run, there is a very deleterious consequence to creating an incentive structure where Putin gets to boost his national rep, his prestige, with a successful land grab in Ukraine. I think it would have been disastrous if he could have just marched west and taken the territory, because it would have reaffirmed and rewarded all the worst possible behaviors from him. That doesn't mean I think that we should sort of do a victory lap around Russia. You know, Cold War II, let's win, let's trounce them in Ukraine. I do think that we're in a tough situation because we can't just like magically make Russia, I guess, a democracy or a country less incentivized to invade its neighbors or reclaim historical territory. It's a difficult question, which is why I don't like simple answers.
So, Dave, actually, here's an interesting point that Vaush just raised about the beginning of the war. And, you know, if we may all agree, correct me if I'm wrong, that we all think it would have been bad if Putin had indeed marched into Kiev and took all of Ukraine, et cetera. But that leads us to the question, Dave, of how much U.S. involvement, if any, was just. If we agreed that it was good for the U.S. to perhaps prevent the Russian capture of Kiev, et cetera, at what point did it become too much? At what point is the support no longer just or moral? How do you respond to that, Dave?
I think that the point that you could start at a lot of different points. I think the first round of NATO expansion was unjust and was unnecessarily provocative of the Russians. Let me just,
the first round of NATO expansion, in 1999, which was years after the Soviet Union collapsed, and it was after the Soviet Union started funding the fucking Transnistria and Moldova, and then the did shit in the Chechnyan war, as well as the shit in South Odessa too.
I'm not exactly sure what Vaush is referring to as like a cowardly non-argument. I simply was directly responding to Ryan's point. If you have a serial killer who's killed far more people than another serial killer, and they claim that they're trying to stop a serial killer because they're so against killing, it's reasonable to point out that no, this is in fact not what's motivating U.S. foreign policy, that no, the butcherers of Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and Libya and Yemen are not actually motivated by some sense of we can't let big guys pick on little guys. Let's have an honest conversation about what's really motivating this policy. And it has been, since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to increase the power of the American empire. And Russia has always been seen as a force that...
But I mean, using his terminology here, okay? Which I may disagree to whatever extent. But if NATO had disbanded in 91, the world would be a much better place. I don't agree with that. I think Russia would probably be invading more countries if NATO disbanded. But anyway, because Russia was invading countries prior to NATO expanding in 1999. Anyway, I think the current world order kind of serves the U.S. empire, right? A lot of the current world order seems to support the U.S. empire. So I think defending Ukraine kind of upholds the world order that currently the world order is such that it's very costly for bigger countries to invade their smaller neighbors. I think that's what the U.S. is trying to uphold. The U.S. is trying to uphold the sovereignty of nations generally, and territorial integrity of countries. I think upholding that is important, even if upholding that also is somewhat beneficial to the U.S., obviously.
That's outside of the American empire. That's what's been motivating American foreign policy. This is what we're living through here, is largely the neoconservative doctrine. It was the worst thing that ever happened in the history of our country, is that after we became probably the first ever true global superpower, about 10 years later, the neoconservatives got control of our foreign policy. And this was their plan from the very...
Is that what NATO was doing in Yugoslavia? No, we were preventing a genocide in Yugoslavia.
Beginning. So no, I don't think...
Or Libya. In Libya, NATO did a no-fly zone, which was approved by the UN Security Council.
America should have been involved in Ukraine at all. And I certainly don't think that anything we've done has done anything except make this situation much worse and much, much more dangerous, because now you are experiencing a proxy war with the two biggest nuclear superpowers. I don't think saying any of that is reducing things down to simplistic worldview. And of course, Vaush,
it's probably not, Panda.
Kind of snuck a straw man in there. I wouldn't say that this conflict is entirely because of NATO expansion, but to pretend like that's not a major driving factor in this conflict.
Kosovo is Soviet. Kosovo is Kosovo.
I
don't have a strong position on Kosovo. I haven't done like a ton of reading into it, but like the NATO involvement in Yugoslavia probably did prevent some of the ethnic cleansing and bad stuff of the of Kosovo people and Albanians. Yeah.
Not be dealing with reality. And this has been admitted by all of the top people on both sides. And this was why so many people within the national security apparatus in the 90s opposed the first round of NATO expansion, explicitly because this will provoke a reaction from the Russians.
There was no genocide that that the CIA didn't instigate. Even if we, what do you mean CIA didn't? Okay. Even if I took for granted that the CIA instigated the genocide, okay, there's a genocide happening. If the Serbians are doing a genocide, we should probably stop that genocide, right? Or do we disagree with that?
Through the years, the Russians have been crystal clear that Ukraine was their red line. Thanks to the greatest journalist of the 21st century, the hero Julian Assange, who is thankfully now a free man, we know that the current head of the CIA, Burns, told Condoleezza Rice this explicitly, that this was a red line, and not a red line in the way that America makes up red lines. Like Obama will say, if Assad uses a certain type of weapon on his people, that's a red line for us. It's all just ridiculous. This is a red line.
Also, I mean, people are going to say, Maidan coup, Maidan coup, Maidan coup. But from 2008 to 2014, Ukraine's status with NATO did not change at all, and Russia still took Crimea.
In a true sense.
Clearly, NATO expansion was not the issue here. Now people are going to say, oh, the Maidan coup was the issue. But, yeah.
In the sense that Jack Kennedy said, putting nuclear missiles in Cuba is a red line for us. We will blow up the world if you try to do that. Vladimir Putin, and as Burns pointed out, not just Vladimir Putin, the entire Russian establishment has been unanimous on this, that they will not tolerate Ukrainian entry to NATO. And look, it's not justified or reasonable for Vladimir Putin to have launched this war, but on the scale of geopolitical demands, the demand that Ukraine cannot be a part of the American empire's military alliance was a fairly reasonable one. And we could have avoided this whole war by just committing to that.
I have a quick follow-up on that, Dave. So
sure.
all things, we're dealing in the reality that we did push for the NATO expansion in 2014 and all of that considered, is your position that there should have been like basically zero aid, military, whatever else, government aid to Ukraine after the invasion a couple of years back, like basically just none?
Absolutely. If there was any role for the Americans to play, it would have been trying to negotiate an end to the war. Unfortunately, if you're putting me in the hypothetical of like, you can't change anything before this, but you're already here, we had probably blown all of that goodwill, and there were better parties who would have been more suited for that. For example, going back to even the Bucharest summit in 2008 into the beginning of the Maidan Revolution, Germany was much more hesitant to get involved, to go down this path. There were other European countries who were kind of like, hey, let's not provoke the Russians. It's part of the reason why Ukraine didn't get a full map invitation in 2008 is the objection of the Germans. So probably someone else would have been better at it. Yes, essentially what I'm saying is that the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, the most war-hungry country in the world, the United States of America, shouldn't have been the ones at the table at all. And there might have been some goodwill from other parties who had more of an interest to avoid this catastrophe.
And if I may, I just there are elements of this that I guess don't make sense to me. First of all, the claim that America's decision-making is based on it trying to expand its own geopolitical power rather than any altruistic interest. That's true, but that's also the case for all countries. That's basic IR theory. So the idea of like, well, this neocon theory of America expanding its interest, that's just nation states. Russia's doing that right now. India's doing that. China's doing that. Everyone's doing that. We're better at it because we're a superpower, of course. But that's like a fundamental rule of national exchange. I don't think that it's really a moral question. It's a matter of material conditions in a basic Marxist sense. Who's motivated by what and where they are. In the modern
no, we're getting to the Marxists
world, the imperial sphere of influence extends to the entire planet. American jets can reach any part of the world in 24 hours. Everyone's can if they have jets. There's no we get the nation next to us, which makes me think the idea that Ukraine is more innately in the Russian sphere of influence is, I think it's a little bit old hat. At the end of the day, the people in Ukraine were interested in closer relations with the EU, and that is ultimately what triggered.
I don't know. Do we think it was? Ukraine was cooperating with us for a while, right? Like Ukraine has been integrating into the West. Maybe. Wasn't Russia violating the Budapest Memorandum? Isn't that kind of a red line that the U.S. set? Just yeah. I hate all these arguments about the red line that Russia set was that was Ukraine NATO membership. Okay, well the red line we set was fucking Russia violating the Budapest Memorandum, and they fucking did that in 2013 and then in 2014 as well. Are you saying we can't help defend Ukraine when Russia violates the Budapest Memorandum, but Russia gets to just arbitrarily decide that if Ukraine were to join NATO, that's now too much NATO on the border. So now Russia gets to invade Ukraine to prevent that?
Triggered everything from Euromaidan, Yanukovych fleeing, the annexation of Crimea, the invasion of the Donbass following the invasion of Ukraine broadly. This is, again, a complicated situation. I don't mean to detract from the influence that Western arrogance had in it. I would never try to do that. But I do think that, your road...
What were the terms of the Budapest Memorandum? That, welcome to the stream, by the way, Horseradish. Although I talked to you before. Terms of the Budapest Memorandum was Ukraine gave up its nukes. Was Russia the only one to break them? My understanding is that Russia broke them first, right? Unless you're going to say that the Belarus sanctions in 2013 broke them, which I haven't done a ton of reading into it, but I'm pretty sure they didn't. The terms is that Ukraine would give us nukes in exchange for Russia and the other parties, which was like the US, the UK, basically saying respecting Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, and not resorting to the threat or use of force or economic coercion.
Roadmap for how things should have progressed from an American perspective following the 2022 invasion is misguided, because I don't think the world would be any farther from annihilation if Russia had simply marched westward, taken Kyiv, and we had a bunch of ginned up Russian soldiers right up against the border of Poland, having just successfully annexed former Soviet/Russian imperial territory. You can imagine the propaganda coming out of the Kremlin about how they're reuniting their people. They're sort of like expanding the Russian interest in like a Duginist ethnic sense, reclaiming the empire. I think that like the incentive structure behind that would be really bad. Like that, you're basically you're throwing chum into the water for sharks. Putin is expansionist. He's been sort of like preempting this for a long time with Georgia, his behavior with the Chechens. I don't think that would bring us any closer to peace. Now, is the current path we're on right now the best possible road? Obviously not. Nothing we ever do is the best possible road, but I think it's closer to threading that line than just letting them march westward with them. What I'm interested in, I guess, is practical solutions now, outside of just letting Ukraine get annexed, which I really don't think would have been good for world peace in the long run, even if it would have quickly ended the conflict. How do we incentivize Ukraine and Russia to come to the table and bring an end to this war? Can Ukraine regain its lost territory? I think morally it should be able to, because I don't like nations being rewarded for annexing adjacent territory. But logistically, can they? Would it be possible to end things where they are now? Would Russia keep Crimea and that just be seen as a kind of like dull historical injustice to fade away over time? And 100 years from now, people would be like, did you know Crimea used to be Ukraine? I don't know. There's so much dogmatism. And whenever you bring up like modern solutions, people go back to, I don't know, the end of the Cold War. I understand NATO is not exactly a global force for good, but what can we do now? I so rarely hear answers that are contextualized in the current moment.
Sure. Can I respond to that? Because there's a few, I want to answer your question at the end there, but just like a few things I want to point out. Number one, I think this is almost like bigger than just any political debate. There's it's a broader theme in life in general. I think anybody who's married, who's on the show or listening to the show knows this is true in personal relationships. There's a tendency to, if you're in an argument with your wife or your husband or something like that, to focus on what they did and what they did that's bothering you. But a much more healthy posture, if you're in a successful relationship, is that you also add in like, okay, well, what am I doing? How am I participating in this? What have I done that's kind of led to this situation? Generally speaking, I think that if you look at the corporate media, you're going to hear all of this talk about what Putin's done. And I think a lot of times in these debates, people can kind of claim to be like, well, I have a more nuanced position. I'm not simplifying things. I think the point of saying that like, well, all governments are expansionist by
Vaush just annoys me. That's kind of valid.
Nature. So there's no difference between the neoconservatives and say other groups of people. I'm not saying they're the same, but like a logical analogy, it's like, oh, well, all governments kill people. So like what Adolf Hitler's doing is just kind of the same as other governments. It's not exactly true. It's kind of different in scale and in kind. To sit here and say, and look, if we have time, we could go through the history of Chechnya and Georgia and all this stuff. But to zoom out a little bit, during the Cold War, we drew the line at the Elbe River, halfway through Germany. On one side was the Soviet Union, on the other side was NATO.
I know,
and
yeah.
We're now,
why did all these countries why did Poland want to join NATO? Why did the Baltic states want to join NATO? I wonder why.
talking about Ukraine, and you could sit here with a straight face and say, Putin is expansionist. Okay. If that's how you want to look at it, it's like, let's just look at the actual reality of what's happening here. It's not that Putin has been this expansionist force. Putin has been almost at every turn reacting to the expansion of the American empire. And Ukraine, that's just not true. It's not denying someone agency to say that they're responding to something. That doesn't make any sense at all.
To everything. That's all life.
Sure.
No one just acts without, you didn't fall out of a coconut tree.
That's just a cop-out.
You're the one providing the cop-out. You're saying that like it's not possible for Putin to have like a distinctly expansionist element to his rule because everyone's just responding to. So do you believe Putin has a distinctly expansionist element to his rule?
Okay, no, that's not a binary.
No, I think he's just reacting to the expansion of the U.S. empire.
Do you think he does or doesn't?
So instead of just interrupting me, let me make the point. You just laid out a binary between, is it possible he has expansionist intentions, and does he have expansionist intentions? That's not a binary. There are some expansionist desires that he has. No, in fact, if you actually educate yourself on this topic, it was our CIA director who said in the Niet means Niet memo leaked by Julian Assange that verbatim, this was a choice that Vladimir Putin did not want to have to make. This was a choice that Russia did not want to get involved in this war.
And he made the choice. He made the choice to invade, to bring troops down.
I think Vaush is doing good so far. I think he's doing fine. We're only 20 minutes in. Oh, geez, we're 20 minutes in already. I don't know. I think it's fine.
To the Ukrainian border to commit to multiple years of come on, this is the thing.
They haven't talked about that much.
I asked you for what can we do now, and immediately it's back to the Iron Curtain.
Well, hold on. I know. Hold on. Here's what happened. I'm sorry.
I just want to know in the modern context.
I get it. Actually, what happened was you made a long statement and ended with that question, and I said, let me answer that question, but first let me deal with what you said at the beginning of your statement, and then you started interrupting me. So no, it's not that I'm not willing to answer that question. It's that I had to point out, I think, a lot of the errors that you're making. Now, if you want just to say, what could we do right now? Well, look, we're going to have to be realists about this situation and admit that Ukraine is losing this war and that they're not going to drive Russia out of Crimea. That's a
Be interesting to see Destiny Ben Shapiro debate Dave Smith and Norman Finkelstein about Israel. I don't know if putting Destiny and Ben Shapiro have disagreements over Israeli policy. So I think it'd be weird because like they would be approaching it from like different although I'm sure Dave Smith and Norman Finkelstein have disagreements about Israel Palestine too, but they'd be approaching it from like such different perspectives. Because Ben Shapiro is like literally like a Orthodox, or I don't know if it's necessarily Orthodox, but he's a religious Zionist, versus Destiny is just like a secular two-stater, right? So
joke. They're not going to drive Russia out of many of the territories that they've taken right now. We should be working
Ben Shapiro doesn't actually know
toward a deal,
he's an Orthodox Jew, yeah.
Peaceful solution, which has been on the table several times throughout this war, and it's been the West who has been trying to squash it.
Well, that's
what we should
not
do.
true at all, though. You've seen, I assume you've read the deals that Putin has put through. Zelensky hasn't been particularly amenable to them himself. The narrative that the West is squashing the peace deals, which is blown up largely because of that one Boris Johnson visit early on in the conflict. Don't get me wrong, okay? The West has its own interest. There are plenty of Western leaders who would like to see the Russian armories depleted. But that doesn't mean that Ukraine would have been jumping in the bit for any of the deals Putin's been offering since the war began. And Ukraine hasn't been losing. Both countries have been stalling. This has been like a slog, and it has been since the first, or after the first 3 months of the war. I don't like the narrative that Ukraine's losing, because the fact that they exist at all at this point, considering the Russian armaments aligned against them, is pretty impressive.
I mean, they're pulling guys off the streets to fight.
Oh, yeah, but like, and Russia has like their penal colony forces with the Wagner group, like pulling from their multiple rounds.
No, Russia's getting their North Korean troops now too.
Like really unpopular conscriptions, waves of immigration out of Russia. People.
That.
No, of course not. I'm not arguing that like it's a matter of our investment or whether or not it's moral. You know, war makes, unfortunately, unethical decision making of every side, including the good ones. The Allies did plenty of bad stuff during World War II. I'm only saying that it's been a slog for both sides. I don't want to see this out in like I don't want this conflict to end in a way that's going to guarantee the conflict reemerges in 2 years. If you end up just setting the border right where the fighting lines are right now, we're going to be exactly where we were back in 2014. We're going to have a combination of like paid separatists and Russian soldiers like moving around in the Donbass. There's going to be constant exchanges of fire across the border. This needs like a real international solution. I don't know whether that means like a proper DMZ. I don't know whether that means like genuine reconciliation. Ideally for me, it would be some kind of like Hail Mary where Ukraine gets its borders back and there's like a massive like coming together between Russia and the West, and we like reopen trade and negotiations, but that's a little bit of a pipe dream. We do agree that, at least let's agree on this. If the line just freezes where it is right now, are we not guaranteeing another conflict in a few years?
I don't know that that's possible to say, to be honest.
People be pretty mad. People be firing across the border.
It's not guaranteeing it. I don't know.
Ukraine
you
and
do,
Russians, especially at the front, are not positively disposed to each other. I feel like we need to give them something solid, a solid peace. Not just like, oh, we've decided now this slog has gone on for too long. They'd be throwing rocks at each other across the border, you know? You could get a 5-mile wide DMZ and they'd still be like sending drones over with bricks to drop at each other's heads.
Maybe this is all,
it'd be rough.
With the case of in general, with all of the war hawks, everybody who's supported every single war over the last 20 years, it always kind of relies on this unfalsifiable counterfactual. Like, oh, if we didn't do this, then Vladimir Putin would be invading Poland right now. Or if the lines were drawn where they are, they'd be throwing rocks at each other. It's very hard to say. I think the one thing that, I think it's, again, to rely on a counterfactual, if that's what we're doing, I think the truth is that there were a lot of much better options. There were off-ramps all throughout the path to get here. And the truth is that if you want to go back to 2014, the West should not have gotten involved.
I feel like all of those options would have violated Ukrainian sovereignty in one way or another. Would it be not letting them join NATO or not letting them join the EU or anything? Yeah, it would have all been violating Ukrainian sovereignty to some extent, and it would have again also just incentivized bigger countries to pick on their neighbors, to bully their neighbors. If we show the world like, hey, if you have nuclear weapons and you're a big country, we're just gonna let you fucking coerce your neighbor into not being allowed to join NATO, not being allowed to, where's the other, I guess Crimea, yeah, not being able to, the EU, another big thing.
That it did. That it was such a provocation to back the overthrow of a democratically elected government. All you have to do is think to yourself and just be honest here.
We're in the past.
Hold on, let me just finish my point. If Russia or China,
the Maidan coup,
had backed
which the evidence for is one leaked phone call leaked by Russia themselves, and it's one snippet of a leaked phone call of diplomats expressing a preference for the next leader. Not very substantive.
Overthrow of the government in Mexico or Canada because they opted to sign a trade deal with us rather than the one that they wanted them to sign. What do you think DC would do? And we all know the answer to that. They'd overthrow that government in a second. And we have a Monroe Doctrine for a reason. And you can say that it's like some relic of the past that faraway superpowers ought not intervene in the region of other large nations, but we certainly wouldn't feel that way. We wouldn't think it was a relic of the past if anybody tried to come over here and set up a military alliance with Mexico.
Well, I mean, if the U.S. was constantly invading our neighbors, which, I mean, we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan, and and other shit in the Middle East too, but it's different from what Russia does. Although Russia did their shit in Chechnya too. After they were part of the global war on terror, people forget about that. Russia fought terrorists in Chechnya. But other than that, if the U.S. is making a lot of threats towards Mexico, then Mexico probably does have justification to join some Chinese military alliance to prevent a U.S. invasion of Mexico.
Mexico or with Canada? Tell me how much DC would go, oh yes, the Monroe Doctrine is just a relic of the past.
Do you think the Bay of Pigs invasion was justified?
No.
Because the Soviets invested economically and militarily into a country that is just off our coast during a time of heightened international conflict. They knew that it would antagonize us. We already had strained relationship with Castro, even though we didn't initially, of course, because we recognized that he was a much better leader for the Cuban people than the man he replaced. Do you not think the Soviets antagonized us in a way much comparable to what we have done with NATO and Ukraine? Like,
yes,
again, they did. Okay. So do you think then following the Bay of Pigs... Wait. I mean,
so JFK was just reacting to it.
This isn't a gotcha. I think it's an interesting question because I do think the Soviets were a little bit wacky with how they handled Cuba, but I feel like in retrospect, we don't talk about the Bay of Pigs invasion as an inevitable consequence of expansionist Soviet investment in spite of our national interest. I think we think about it as like Kennedy's mistake, you know?
Right. Okay. But see, a lot of the reason why we think of it as Kennedy's mistake is the logistics of it. By the way, if you really want to get into it, it wasn't Kennedy's mistake as much as
it was the way he followed the previous administration.
But regardless of any of that, see, what you asked me is if I thought the Bay of Pigs was justified. And I would also say that, no, I don't think Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine was justified. Do I think that the Soviets and the Cubans were taking a provocative stance against the United States of America? Of course. Did those provocations lead to the Bay of Pigs? I think that's undeniable. And the truth is that Vladimir Putin's got a much stronger case about the provocations of the United States of America because it's not just one little island or one economic deal. It's been a steady push eastward since the late 90s.
But now that we are where we are. Oh, no, go right
Before we go too far, I just want to stand up for the dignity of the Cuban Revolution for just a moment.
Please.
Least surprising development.
Yeah, it was not a Soviet project. This was an organic Cuban project against the corrupt elites in Cuba. Fidel Castro, in the beginning, thought he could.
I mean, they're all going to say Maidan coup. Ukraine's just a puppet of the U.S. and that's why they're joining NATO. But Ukraine is a mostly democratic nation that democratically chose to. Well, I say democratically chose to join NATO, but Ukraine's NATO status has not actually changed that much. They've always just been kind of on the back burner, saying, "Hey, maybe later. Maybe we'll review your status later." I think after the invasion, the official position is now that Ukraine will eventually be in NATO. But yeah,
maintain some decent relations with the United States. It was Che Guevara who witnessed in 1954. He was in Guatemala when the U.S. overthrew Arbenz, and he was the one always saying to Fidel Castro, "You're not going to be able to work with the Yankees. Like, it's not possible." Castro wanted to. Like, he was like, "Look, no, these guys are corrupt. You know, I'm George Washington here." It was only when it became impossible for the Cubans to work, for the Cuban revolutionaries to work with the U.S., that they went in the Soviet direction.
And in fact, Ryan,
doesn't make it just, but go ahead, Dave.
Well, correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I also believe that Castro had been rejecting communism up to the point that the U.S. started putting embargoes on him before he then said, "Oh yeah, I'm a communist." And so you could certainly argue that we drove him into the hands of
democratically chose to join an evil alliance that have provoked a lot of pain around the world. Russia is fighting for its future. True. Well, yeah, entirely wrong. Russia is fighting for its future, so it can capture Ukraine. Russia's fighting for its ability to annex more Ukraine in the future. Yeah, true.
Of the Soviets.
Right, and I think it plays further into the broader dynamic where basically everybody acts as a reaction to previous acts. Very rarely does something, sort of come up whole cloth. You almost always, even for the United States, I mean, with all of our power, we are still responding to, the actions and decision-making of agents that are themselves responding to others. In the world today, where we are now, because there are a million places that I could have turned the clocks back and like changed history, it brought us to a different point. For me personally, the big line wasn't with NATO. It was with economic investment in Russia and the shock therapy. I think that was the real line where we lost the post-Cold War world, where we arrogantly decided that, having won over the Soviets, we would do a victory lap by annihilating their economies, arrogantly pillaging them and leaving them to the oligarchs who would work with us in a business relation sense. If there was anything I could go back and change, it would be that. I'm not really particularly fussed about NATO in particular. Military alliances are always going to carry with them, let's say, problematic elements. NATO is just the Western military alliance, everything that insinuates and carries. If we got along with Russia properly, maybe all of this could have been avoided. I mean, hell, it could have extended far enough east. We could be on better relations with China. We wouldn't have people like Trump trying to constantly push for a second Cold War with the tariff. And well, Biden did that too recently with the electric vehicles. So I guess everybody wants a Cold War with China. Things could
That
have been
really
better.
started with Obama.
Yeah, no, because we need a foreign threat. We need a foreign threat.
Exactly.
Russia wasn't doing it for us, and they're certainly not going to be doing it now.
Well, but
partly
I think,
because
so let me just say, because I think there's something almost being lost here where, look, that technically speaking, you are right that everybody is reacting. And you are right that every nation is, like, I'm a radical libertarian. I think basically, essentially, all governments are criminal organizations. So you don't have to, like, convince me on that. The thing here that separates things is that after 1991, America became the first global superpower. The level of power, it's funny, I have to explain this to a leftist, but the level of power that America had was totally...
Why the fuck are they still talking about this, dude? They don't disagree on this point. And Vaush just literally, like, said his fucking, like, lefty take that, like, oh, it's not even, like, that necessarily of a lefty take that, like, the U.S. did do some bad thing about the Cold War when we fucking didn't, what was it? The shock therapy in Russia that, like, led to the rise of Putin. Vaush is, like, already agreed on this, man. I don't know why they're still talking about it. I also don't... the reason we only started pushing for more NATO membership after the European country, it's like literally we're fucking begging to join NATO. Okay, the first round of expansion happened in 1999. And Clinton, I think Clinton didn't initially want a lot of these countries to join NATO, but eventually, I think Poland was the big one. Poland literally went behind Clinton's back and, like, started talking to the Republican candidate. I forget his name, but the Republican candidate to try to, like, undermine Clinton's reelection. Yeah, that's why the NATO expansion happened. It only happened after that. It only happened because the European countries wanted to join NATO so fucking badly that they were willing to literally fucking blackmail the U.S.
asymmetrical to anything else. And
I'm
so,
just hearing
yes,
this for the first
time. Right. And so yes, it is true that there are all of these different nations that are reacting to different things. However, if you actually look at the role that the United States of America played, and then think about it from, say, the Russian perspective, that this is not something that and you may say from your perspective that, the NATO military alliance isn't your biggest concern. Okay, but it is the Russians. And you have to see from their perspective that they would see this as a threat that they cannot live with.
Again, it's like between 2008 and 2014, the Ukraine status with NATO didn't change at all, and Russia still took Crimea.
And the fact is that the idea of Ukrainian entry into NATO was something that was floated out for years, and not just in 2008 at the Bucharest summit where they announced that Ukraine and Georgia would be joining NATO, but for years after that, and then more and more involvement.
They did not announce that they would be joining NATO. I think they announced that, like, their status would be under review.
Especially after the coup in 2014, joint military exercises with NATO and the Ukrainian military, which is part of the reason why.
Maidan coup. Hold on. I don't have that, like, good notes on Ukraine. I just, like, watched there's just, like, 2 video essays on it. 2008 NATO summit, Ukraine and Georgia both wanted to join NATO membership action plan. Both were denied because of concerns that, for instance, Germany and Russia perceived as a threat. Were offered a review of their status at the end of the year and got an acknowledgement that they would join someday. An acknowledgement that they would join someday. Okay, there we go. This is all it took for Russia to invade Georgia.
Why Vladimir Putin did not have such a quick, decisive victory right away, as he probably would have before that time.
The degree doesn't make you smart.
Period. But that from the Russian perspective, you have the global empire, the most war-hungry country in the world.
Down into to Harvard. Yeah, and Finkelstein, I don't know where Finkelstein went, but Finkelstein has a PhD, right? And he's still fucking wild.
Very clearly committed to encirclement. Obviously, this is going to be...
my friend, I don't want to just, like leak her DMs, but, like, at some of the conversations we have, we're like, he just, like, cites Finkelstein, and he's like, do you think you're smarter than Finkelstein? I'm like, I never said I'm smarter than Finkelstein. I just said Finkelstein's wrong on this. Like, he's wrong on this.
A recipe for disaster.
And yet, Ukraine's desire to be protected by NATO has been validated by Russia's expansionism.
Well, okay, can I just a couple
I just want to, like, finish.
Thank you again for the intelligent commentary that was necessary, that we needed. Thank you so much, Pan the Man 24. Wow.
If I may, again, you say Russia's greatest fear is NATO. Ukraine's greatest fear was Russia, who ended up being more justified.
Well, okay, so that's
true.
NATO hasn't invaded Russia. Russia did invade Ukraine. There's no getting away from it. At the end of the day, this powder keg was ignited by Russia. And here we are now today with the gunpowder having already left the blaze. Where do we move forward? Because I keep asking, I feel like it's always like, I said before we started the show, you may recall, whenever I debate Israel, you say, it's wrong to genocide these 30,000 such and such Palestinians. And then the people you argue with, the Zionists, they'll go, oh, but what about Camp David? What about the Accords? They draw back into history because they want to avoid the question today. They want to avoid and turn the eyes away from it.
But I'm certainly not avoiding that question. And as I just said,
Twitch didn't like that you said your twink ass. I won't be worried about you when your government sends your twink ass to a transient Belarus. You were willing for that. Listen, I don't think I have the right body type to serve in war well, but if there was a war that I really thought was just, then I would be willing to fight for my country, dude.
A couple minutes ago, it was wrong for Vladimir Putin to invade, and it's wrong for him to be killing people. Right. Oh, I also answered that. But look, this idea that, first of all, the concern from Vladimir Putin was never, and not even Vladimir Putin, the Russians in general, the concern was never as simple as, is NATO going to invade us? The concern was moving military hardware closer and closer to Russia's borders. Okay, so the concern is more akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis. Not that we were ever worried Cuba was going to invade us, but moving military hardware that close to our borders was a legitimate concern, and one that Jack Kennedy said he would blow up the world over. Most Americans, however they feel about the Bay of Pigs, look at that as fairly justified. That was a threat we couldn't live with a knife to our neck. Now, to your point that Ukraine's biggest fear was Russia, and that they just wanted to join NATO because they had this fear of Russia. That's not exactly true. Like, if you know the history of this situation, it was in 2000, I think it's 2008. So it might have been 2006, but there was the State Department admitted that one of the big problems they had is that Ukrainian entry into NATO was just not popular in Ukraine. They estimated that it was about 30%. And so they embarked on a campaign. They literally said, we need the NED and we need the USAID to intervene more to get this support up for NATO membership amongst the Ukrainians. It's not, look, Yanukovych was elected in 2010, and these elections were verified by the EU, because we're all, neoconservatives are such believers in democracy, but only in the places where we feel like we need to import democracy to.
I don't think
not necessarily in Ukraine.
The legitimacy of those results.
Well, okay, but I'm saying it's not as simple as saying that overwhelmingly the Ukrainian people just wanted to join NATO, and DC was just, respecting the wishes of Ukraine.
I don't know about the polls for NATO. I know a little bit more about the polls for EU membership, or slightly in favor of EU membership.
I'm never saying that the West is acting out of altruism. I would never be that silly. And I'm not.
No, but that's not. I'm saying that your point that Ukraine just wanted to join NATO because they feared Russia.
Wanted, but let's turn the clock forward.
Yeah,
right? The Russian economy was stalling. The EU's economy was booming. The Ukrainian people were more interested in economic ties with the EU than they were with Russia. Yanukovych, against the will of the people, and yes, he was democratically elected. Democratically elected leaders can do unpopular things. That's life. He then turned towards Russia and said, because Yanukovych wasn't, we don't have to get into it. Let's say compromised by Russian interest. The people revolted. America supported the Euromaidan revolt because we were interested, of course, in Ukraine having closer ties to us. But nonetheless, and you can take a look at polling from the time, the Ukrainian disgust with Yanukovych's decision was authentic and widely reflected. Yanukovych fled, of course, fearing for his life and well-being. They took his little wealthy boy palace. And then after that, of course, you have the annexation of Crimea and the separatist movement in the Donbass, which was, of course, heavily supported by Russia. And then, of course, after that, they want to join NATO because they realized that the moment they do anything that Russia doesn't like, Russia's just going to turn the military on them. So, Vaush, you have to keep moving the clock forward.
But let me just interject there and ask. So we're $175 billion into this as the United States. The Ukrainian death toll is at least 31,000 people. It's probably much, much higher than that. Both sides, minimum around 100,000, but again, probably according to a lot of analysts, much, much higher than that. So to what extent can the United States, this is like higher than the NASA budget last year, the amount of foreign aid we're sending to Ukraine. Is that just? The United States spending that much U.S. taxpayer money?
Give them more. Give them 5x as much, unironically.
Money to protect every inch of the Donbass.
Hurry up, the stream is about to give away some benefits.
With no
Thank
plan.
you, Turbo Viewer.
As of right now, ostensibly no serious plan as to what a peace process would look like going forward. Is that a just outcome for the American taxpayer?
Oh, look, every dollar we give to Ukraine, we don't give to Israel. Okay, so it's like convincing your friends.
That's the best argument I've heard.
I think 85% of the money goes to well, a lot of the aid is like old U.S. military equipment, right? That we just send to Ukraine. I think some of it even saves money because some of it was like expiring artillery shells that it's literally cheaper to give to Ukraine than to dispose of properly here. So some of it even saves money, and then most of the money is spent is given to U.S. companies. I think 85% of it is given to U.S. companies, which great job, is good for the U.S. economy. War is a stimulus at the end of the day. Like as bad as it is, war is a stimulus. It's given to U.S. companies to replace the munitions that we gave to Ukraine.
Yeah, right. It's like convincing your friend to spend money on cigarettes, not fentanyl.
So it replaces our old shit with newer shit. So it makes our military better, and it helps U.S. companies and U.S. jobs.
But I agree that Washington should have a more decisive plan. The lack of a plan, which is a common pattern, by the way, with both the United States and also Netanyahu, so not a fan of that tendency on all sides, is problematic to me. Like I said now, if we just froze the war where it is, because of course Russia, like Putin's peace deals are basically just like forfeit the territory you've lost up until this month. They're not like real conciliatory deals, right? Which of course Putin wants to keep the territory that he's gained. I think that if we just took that, if we pressured Ukraine into taking that, a war would break out again within a year, 2 years maybe, because you would have like the military buildup on either side of the DMZ would be like the greatest. Sorry.
Yeah, you started the conversation talking about not wanting this to be a stalemate that goes on forever. So last year we had this much vaunted counteroffensive. At the time, there were tens of thousands of younger Ukrainian troops who were alive.
Should
and were
donate his money to the Zionists or Nazis? Such a dilemma.
well trained. They were well equipped. They launched this massive, much anticipated counteroffensive. It was a complete disaster, led to an enormous loss of life and loss of equipment. And so, to your question of what do we do next, like why is it the case that a new counteroffensive with older, less well-trained Ukrainian troops and less well-equipped troops would be able to succeed against a more fortified Russian military, while the previous one?
I don't know if maybe more fortified. I don't think the Russian military has gotten, I don't think their position has improved any versus the Ukrainian military. He mentioned I guess they have older troops now, right? Because they're having problems with conscription and stuff. But they received newer equipment, right? Now that second aid package has gone through, so
failed. In other words, like what is this Hail Mary that you're talking about that could change the calculation on the ground to such an extent that it's worth it to continue throwing Ukrainian men and women into the maw of this war?
Well, I don't like the term throwing only because they are, of course, engaged in it, right? They're not just being
they're being grabbed in many cases and literally thrown.
45-year-old men.
Well, not literally. Yes. Ukrainian morale, or at least interest in continuing the war, is still high. But that sort of nitpick aside, I would only say, the Hail Mary is something that I hope for. It's not something that I think is guaranteed. With the introduction of ATACMS and other relatively long-range, munitions, we have the ability to sort of.
Oh, and also the F-16s and the long-range munitions, and the fact that they can strike within inside Russian territory now.
Provide Ukraine the option to strike at depots, refineries, and facilities that are closer to the sort of back lines of the conflict. And that has had a massive effect in the past 4 or 5 months since that was introduced. I don't know whether that's going to be a game changer in the war in the long run. I hope that it is, because ultimately I do think that a conciliatory position from Russia would be a better way of ending this conflict than one in which things just freeze as they are now. The DMZ buildup along the line that people settled on right now would be catastrophic, and I think it would just guarantee further war. My hope, and this is, I know perhaps a little naive of me, but I still have a little bit in me that hopes for this. My hope is that eventually, following the expansion of Ukraine's ability to strike at further back targets, this becomes increasingly economically untenable for Russia. There's pressure from both sides. Hey, this has gone on long enough. We literally can't keep this going anymore. We're both on fumes. And like two exhausted boxers on the 14th round, they both collapse into each other's arms. And they have a Christmas day. And
let's all cheer for the streaming together.
There's a moment.
Thank you so much, Strova viewer Clifton44, who is definitely not a bot.
Where for a second things get rough enough, long enough that they collapse and they just can't do it anymore. And maybe the world.
How many Ukrainians were forcibly conscripted versus volunteer would be interesting. I figure many of the forced conscriptions still support continued fighting, so I don't know. At the beginning of the war, it was almost all volunteers. I don't know how many people are conscripted now, but I would imagine they're definitely conscripting more people now. But as a percentage of the total, it's still probably pretty low.
Breathes a sigh of peace as they finally do settle on whatever line they're at that point.
It's quite a dangerous game to play, man. I mean, I know it was the neocons.
All dangerous, right?
Well, sure, but I'm just saying, it was the neocons' hope that if you overthrew Saddam Hussein, democracy would sweep the region, and that would have been nice, I guess. But the hope that if they strike inside of Russia, that will make Russia realize that this war just has cost us a little bit too much, and we sure should knock off this war business. That's quite a risky game to play. There's a couple of things that I want to. Well, let me just respond to a couple things you said there, because things that I think are pretty interesting. So, number one, just a couple points of correction. I mean, I know I said it was a good point in jest, but no, it's not true that every dollar that goes to Ukraine is a dollar that doesn't go to Israel. I mean, as you know, we print money out of thin air, and the U.S. government is quite fine to spend well beyond its means.
True.
So no, they can deficit
MMT or Dave
finance
Smith.
Through fiat currency both of these wars at the same time. Now, what that's going to do to our dollar?
Equipment too, not just money.
Sure. Yeah, no, mostly we're just bribing the military-industrial complex and sending old weapons over there. However,
I can't find. All I see is that Ukraine lowers its conscription age, but I don't know how many troops Ukraine forcefully conscription. I don't know. $1.25 million active personnel. Just waiting until Russia gets the highly trained Kim Jong-un super soldiers. Both nations are sending their YouTube meat grinder. Maybe Ukraine wouldn't want to release those numbers. Probably not.
There is, as you brought up the talk of agency before, it is true that individuals have agency. It's also true that there's such a thing as moral hazard. So if I were to just say, I'll start giving, hey, Ryan, I'm going to start giving you $1 million a month. And then you quit your job and you sit at home. And I go, look, he doesn't want to work. He doesn't want to work. He wants to stay home. He doesn't want to. It's like, well, yeah, okay, there is some truth to that. But might that have, the Ukrainians just want to fight. Okay, but might that have something to do with the blank check that they've received from the world? So the whole point here, right, is that, and this is true with Israel and with Ukraine, what happens is that when the biggest bully in the history of the world, the US empire, says, we got your back, people get a lot braver than they otherwise would. If Israel didn't have unconditional support from the United States of America, they'd be forced to make a deal with some of their neighbors. And same with Ukraine. You say like, oh, if the war ended, Ukraine would...
I mean, we look at like 67 specifically. The reason is a big reason Israel did a preemptive strike in 67 was because they didn't have any security guarantees from the West.
Would just be ready to fight Russia again in a few years without our backing, without us arming them, without all of Europe behind them? No, they wouldn't, because they know it's a fight they couldn't possibly win.
Dave, what's a riskier game to play? I mean, I think I know what your answer would be to this, but what's a riskier game to play? Is it allowing Putin to expand unchecked, just to go back to the argument that Vaush made earlier? Or I think
giving Israel weapons probably gives us, I mean, or in Ukraine too, gives us like leverage over how they're used. It gives us the ability to kind of control, to some extent, their policies, right? And then, I think if you don't have the blank check from the Western Empire, then you probably are going to be more nervous about what other countries are able to do to you. So that's why Israel did a preemptive strike in 67. That's why they took so much territory. Israel was more isolated and more aggressive prior to US backing. True.
Or is it, escalating the war? It seems as though there are risks in both scenarios. And why is one riskier than the other at this point?
Well, look, I mean, okay, so the biggest risk that, again, as I mentioned at the beginning, we should all be concerned about is the potential of nuclear war. And what's prevented the nuclear war in the past has been private negotiations, handshake agreements, and mutually assured destruction. The fact that, nobody really wants to get into a nuclear exchange because we all lose. The only time, especially now because the current administration isn't doing handshake deals or even having conversations behind the scenes with the Russians, the only thing that could lead to a nuclear exchange, so in other words, the worst case scenario is that Vladimir Putin actually thinks he's going to...
Subsequently, especially military is actually a big part of national needs of Israel. They prepare to fight even without the U.S. if need be. Yeah, that's always been a big thing for Israel. Is there continued quest for military might, for military deterrence.
Gonna die. He thinks he's going to end up like Muammar Gaddafi. Mm-hmm. And that's the scenario where you might end up launching nukes just because, screw it, bring everybody down with you. In terms of the risk of Russian expansion, I do think that Vaush made a somewhat fair point where, look, between the mix of, this is my point, not yours,
I love that they're all calling him Vaush when most people call him Vaush. And I think technically he said the correct pronunciation is Vaush. It's funny to me. People respect his correct pronunciation.
Between the mix of NATO joint military exercises with the Ukrainian government, the massive amounts of foreign aid.
In America, liberals are mixed on Israel-Palestine, supportive strongly Ukraine. Conservatives are mixed in Russia-Ukraine, strongly supportive of Israel. Dave Smith is he's not a Republican, but he's a libertarian. He's like a right-wing guy. The right wing are becoming increasingly anti-Israel. Strongly support. Sorry, libertarians are mixed in Palestine and mixed in Israel, Russia. Is that accurate? I guess for the most part.
The weapons shipments that Ukraine has got, going back to before the invasion of 2022, but certainly since 2022, it has made Ukraine a tougher adversary than they otherwise would have been. Vladimir Putin famously said back in 2008, when he was warning Burns, who was the ambassador to Russia at the time, that I could be in Kiev in 2 weeks. Mm-hmm. Well, I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's a tougher battle for him than that. But then also, you think because he ends up getting the eastern part of Ukraine, he's moving on Poland after that?
Mainstream conservatives still are. Yeah,
I think there's absolutely no reason to think that that's the situation. I don't think the bottom line is
that he's right next to Poland. It seems like, given the history of NATO and everything else, that's pretty dangerous too.
Well, I don't know. I mean, the whole argument that all of the people who wanted to bring Ukraine into NATO made was that, well, he won't attack them if they're a NATO country. Now he's going to go after Poland. I just don't see it as being very likely. I don't think the guy's on a suicide mission. I think, as Burns told Condoleezza Rice, that it was never a suicide mission. It was a choice they didn't want to have to make. That's what our intelligence was saying at the time. And so, no, I don't think that there is, to pretend, look, I think American expansionism has been more of a threat to the American Republic than anything else. The idea that Putin is somehow some type of existential threat to America, I think, is, aside from the nuclear question, just not true. I think that there has been an effort for many years now by the entire political class and the entire corporate media to demonize Vladimir Putin in oftentimes the most cartoonish, ridiculous ways. He stole the election in 2016. He's got bounties on U.S. soldiers' heads in Afghanistan. Now,
especially the Baltic countries, because I think the big thing with the Baltic countries especially is... Oh, I forgot Israel Israel. Google Maps doxes my location, guys, whenever I open it. Los Angeles. Can you believe I live there, guys? I think the big concern with the Baltic countries is that Belarus is a Russian puppet. And they have Kaliningrad here. And this is a big choke point because these are Lithuania, Poland, NATO countries, and then these are the Russian territories, right? Kaliningrad is Russia, and then Belarus is a Russian puppet, and there's this little 50-mile border here that in theory Russia could invade, and then there's and then these are all isolated. Although now at least we have every country surrounding the Baltic Sea is a NATO country now, so you know, even if they get cut off by land, by sea, there's at least still Lake NATO.
Our perspective here, right? People like in, say, this alternative media space like Breaking Points is in, we all kind of laugh and mock this stuff. Like, oh, it's so ridiculous. Look at how the CIA is lying to everybody and they actually fell for it. And look how it's been exposed. But from Vladimir Putin's perspective, all of the most powerful people in the most war-hungry, powerful country in the world have essentially been saying over and over again that he declared war on us. I mean, you tell me, because I know you guys have covered this stuff a lot. How many people in the corporate media and in the intelligence apparatus said that the fake overthrowing of the elections in 2016 was worse than Pearl Harbor? They were saying out loud for years that he's declared war on us. Now, if you're Vladimir Putin, you can't just laugh at that. You have to take that seriously. It was William Perry, Bill Clinton's defense secretary, who said that Vladimir Putin believes that it is the U.S. That the U.S. policy is to overthrow Vladimir Putin. Now, I don't know for sure whether he's right about that or wrong. It wouldn't surprise me if he was right. That does sound a lot like my government. But that's the perspective that he's got to come to this from. And I think all it takes is, as I believe it was John Mearsheimer who coined the term, strategic empathy. And that's all you kind of need in this scenario. It's not empathy for its own sake. It's strategic empathy. The same thing that you need to understand the Palestinians, the same thing you need to understand Al-Qaeda, is that these, I'm not saying they're good groups. Some of them are, some of the Palestinians are good people, but some of them are terrorist organizations. Al-Qaeda is a terrorist organization. Vladimir Putin is a despot, but they also can have legitimate grievances. And we ought to, if we want to ignore those, then okay, but we ignore those at our own peril.
I just want to say, if I may, like, respectfully, again, no talking about the present or what to do now. And this is my frustration with this conversation.
Let me give you something.
And also, we don't extend strategic empathy to Ukraine, who is worried about a Russian invasion, and then Russia did invade them.
I promise I'll be very, very quick on this. But the other point that I just did want to make to you, as you bring that up again, it's actually not the case that when I have all of these Israel-Palestine debates, that I want to talk about what's going on right now, and they want to talk about all of the history that led to this point. It's actually quite the opposite. Sagar made this point when he moderated a debate recently for me on Breaking Points when he was recapping it the next day. The truth is that all of the pro-Israel supporters want to just talk about October 7th to today. And everybody who's critical of Israel actually wants to go back through the history and talk about all of it, because, yeah, it's important to understand the history to understand what position we're in now.
It is.
Vaush, let me bring you up to this week, since you want to talk about today. So this is from earlier this week from Zelensky's top advisor. You probably saw this quote. He's got a couple others out there publicly. He's saying this in English, so we don't even have to hit the translate button.
Nice
very nice of him. After the attack on the beach in Crimea, he said, quote, "There are not and cannot be any beaches, tourist zones," those are his quotes, "and other fictitious signs of, quote, peaceful life in Crimea. Crimea is definitely a foreign territory occupied by Russia, where there are hostilities and a full-scale war, the very war that Russia unleashed for genocidal and invasive purposes only. Crimea is also a large military camp and warehouse with hundreds of direct military targets, which the Russians are cynically trying to hide and cover up with their own civilians, which in turn are considered to be civilian occupiers." So he said this after Ukraine killed civilians on the beach. So are we the baddies here?
I mean, it's almost a perfect mirror of rhetoric employed in the Hamas versus Israel conflict, actually.
I mean, I kind of understand there are pro-Israel people that like to talk about October 7th a lot, but I think it's a very legitimate question to ask. Oh, what should Israel have done to or post October 7th? Because regardless of what the history was, the history led to October 7th, and I think it's valid to ask what Israel should have done in response to that. I think it's weird that people try to obfuscate by going through the history, but yeah.
Where, when Hamas killed civilians on October 7th, the argument was that the civilians were settlers who were occupying stolen land, and therefore you can't reasonably argue they're civilians. And then on the other hand, of course, you have Israelis who say that Hamas uses the Palestinian people as human shields. In the West Bank, you have the argument. It's remarkable actually how many parallels there are and how these are employed. Are we the baddies? Yes, we're all the baddies. Nation states the baddies. That sounds reductive, but that is just the way the game is played. You will never find a nation engaged in war.
There are ways to play the game without explicitly justifying the slaughter of civilians on a beach.
But in practice, if you go back to basically any military conflict where existential threat was on the line, which it certainly is for Ukraine or is in the Israel-Hamas conflict, you will see that this rhetoric and these standards are employed.
Just saying that the appeal to credentials is a silly argument. True.
This is not me arguing that it's justified. It's morally abhorrent because war demands abhorrence of the people who participate in it. You're not going to find any large-scale conflict where stuff like this doesn't happen, which is why, to me, the interesting question is...
It's not even a large-scale conflict in Crimea. Why is the American public supposed to care all of a sudden that Russia controls Crimea? 4 years ago, you would have been laughed at if you suggested that Ukraine ought to go to war to kick Russia out of Ukraine.
Well, that's a separate question. The first one about like the abhorrence of this rhetoric, which by the way, I agree with. I just want to be clear that this is a consequence of like these heightened tensions, which is why I'm interested in what can be done to bring an end to this war, a permanent end, not some middling ceasefire that gets broken almost immediately. In terms of whether or not America should care, I don't know. The average American couldn't find Kabul on a map. The average American doesn't care about anything outside of their own tax breaks. My interest in what the average American cares about is nil. The average American doesn't care about the homeless. Why should I care about what they care about? What I care about is what's good. Sometimes they do. I don't know. The average American with the state of our education, I care about what's good. Nuclear war is bad, by the way. That's where I land in that particular moral equivalence. I think that if we settle with an unjust, tense, quiet with the Russia-Ukraine conflict, we guarantee future conflicts. If you look back at the history of expansionist empires, if you take a look at what Russia is doing now and compare it to the rhetoric employed by other nations that have annexed adjacent territory, you will find they tend not to quit while they're ahead. There's a pattern of overextension.
Let me ask you, so on this piece, you hoped that if there's enough fighting, that eventually these two fighters will become exhausted and kind of peace will break out. But you've also said that if we get a peace deal, then war will eventually break out. So why would the peace from exhaustion not just lead to your fear that 2 years later war would break out again?
Because
it sounds like war is the only logical endpoint of your position here, either position.
I think it needs to be a peace deal that the Russian and Ukrainian people are happy with. Right now, we haven't even gotten close to finding that point, which means the only real end to the conflict would be the complete annexation of Ukraine and the annihilation of all the militias and insurgency groups within it, which would be very difficult considering the fact that Russia has logistical breakdowns 50 miles out of their border, or Ukraine retaking all of its territory, which is at the moment basically unthinkable. It doesn't seem like there's any end to the conflict right now outside of something that could be imposed by a kind of international move to sort of like solidify the line where it is now. And I do think that would just lead to more peace in the future. That's my question. And I don't come to this with a solution, by the way. If I had a solution, or if anyone did, I think you'd be hearing them preaching it a lot more often. I don't like the idea of treating this like team sports or like, well, in actuality, like we could have prevented this if we went back 20, 30, 40 years. I know there's a lot of other cool stuff we could have done. We could have invested in like Apple early too.
Let's say the US tripled the NASA budget and sent it all to Ukraine. Do you think that would be too much US support?
I mean, if we over-support Ukraine, if we commit to it so hard that Ukraine starts pushing back further, my concern would be that the brass in Ukraine would get arrogant and start pushing into Russia. I don't think that's especially likely. Certainly, Ukraine doesn't have the same sort of legacy and cultural pretext of expansionist sentiment the way that like Putin does, but it's possible. I also disagree, by the way, with the strike they did on some of those early warning systems. You showed an article with that headline a little bit ago. I think that's dangerous territory. I don't think that Ukraine has been particularly irresponsible in this conflict as military conflicts go, and that's a pretty low bar. I do think that there's a risk the more we gin them up, the more gung-ho they get, and I think that risk increases the longer this goes on too. So again, we either let Ukraine get washed entirely. I don't even know if Russia could do that at this point, even if we divested from Ukraine. We sort of pressure Ukraine to accept the Russian peace deal as it is now, or we overinvest to the point where they can reclaim their borders, which given enough time and enough money, we unleash Area 51 on the Russians. Sure, maybe Ukraine could do it. Of these three options, which is the most likely to bring about the fewest deaths, the lowest likelihood of long-term nuclear conflict? In my opinion, the path will get clearer the more time goes on because we will increasingly test the willingness of the Russian people to support this ongoing engagement. That sounds horrible. I think this is a horrible situation. That's not me blaming anyone involved, the Pentagon, the Kremlin, whatever else. It's a horrible humanitarian nightmare, but it's also a pretty difficult one to manage. You look back at history and there are empires that were clashing with each other for centuries, over and over again, borders barely changing with each successive war. I don't want that to happen here, not just because we've got nuclear powers involved, but because like it is a collective drain on the spiritual, financial, and military collective of humanity. I just don't want to come at it from a dogmatic position because I don't want to blind myself to avenues of peace that might be unintuitive.
And we're running up against our time limit here. But Dave, any?
Some of those points I would have to think about. I haven't heard a ton about them. I feel like the only, I don't know. I'd probably agree with him. The ceasefire is drawn up now, based on where the lines are. I don't think it'd be necessarily a lasting peace. I think you'd probably have to force Russia into a slightly more conciliatory position. I don't think it's super likely that Ukraine will retake Crimea or even parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, right? But there's probably like I'm trying to think of the names of the places, right? Hold on, Mariupol, this area, the areas that they basically had prior to the full-scale invasion, right? Probably going to be important for Ukraine to take those back. Oh, and Kherson too, although they've already, again, it's at the river, right? But Russian army shelling. Oh man, is this the beach? What's the beach that was just attacked? I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens in the next couple months. How much territory Ukraine gets back after the aid package. Welcome to the stream. If Russia did a full-out war with full draft, Ukraine would be done in 24 hours. Putin is very patient with the puppet. I think it's probably pretty politically unpopular within Russia, to the extent that Putin responds to popular pressure. I don't think full mobilization is doable for him. Like, they were literally concerned that there'd be a well, I mean, we saw Wagner Group literally start marching towards Moscow, right? So I think forced conscription would probably be pretty politically unpopular for Putin, and to the extent that he replies to internal pressure, I think that's probably a big reason why he's not doing it. Because even the conscription he has going on now, it's not that popular. Rest in power, Prigozhin. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, Wagner Group was literally marching towards Moscow before, and now his plane got shot down. Was it ever? I never actually got a full answer. I didn't keep up with it. Was that plane actually shot down? It was shot down, right? Or was it did it just crash normally? Wagner Group plane shot down. I don't know if it was shut down or not. Saw CIA bribe, forget it, then eliminated him. I mean, we did have people in the Wagner Group, right? For intelligence. I'm pretty sure we did. We'd had intelligence in the Wagner, like we literally had inside men in the Wagner Group. The Russian investigation revealed the CIA planted a bomb. Your identification victim, blah, blah, blah. On August 24th, it was reported that flight records had been recovered. The Ministry of Emergency Situations initiated investigation of the incident. Additionally, authorities opened a criminal case on the violations of rules of traffic safety in the airport, blah, 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 whatever. Okay. October 5th, Putin told a meeting and that the Wagner leaders on the flight may have been using alcohol or drugs, and implied that they just blew the jet up themselves with their own weapons. So the hand grenade fragments are found in the bodies. There was no sign of external impact on the aircraft. That 10 billion rubles of cocaine were found in Prigozhin's office, and that, in his opinion, investigators should have performed alcohol and drug tests while autopsying the victims. Putin pointed to foreign intelligence assessments, saying that denying a SAM strike as an implicit confirmation of his hypothesis. The study for Institute of War described Putin's narrative as bizarre. It said he was blaming the victims to discredit Prigozhin's supporters and deflect blame away from the Russian government. CIA planted drugs in a bomb. Do you have evidence for that? I mean, this is just a Wikipedia article, which like could be wrong or whatever, but like it says even Putin doesn't think the CIA planted the drug. Russian internal investigation. This is about the Russian internal investigation, and it does not mention the CIA. I saw it on Russian TV. Oh, okay. Well, I guess you don't have to provide anything for it, so I guess if you just saw it on Russian TV. This is Western news, Tro. This is about the. First of all, I don't know why you would really believe Russian TV, but this is about the internal Russian investigation. CIA bomb. Intentional explosion. Voice of America. Preliminary U.S. intelligence concluded that the plane crash soon to kill Russian leaders. It's intentionally caused by an explosion. You want me to believe your CNN? Haha, dude, there's fucking Wikipedia, bro. I don't know why you would believe Russian state-controlled media more than U.S. media. The U.S. media has problems. I'm not gonna disagree with that. There's some level of manufactured consent that goes on in the U.S. media, but I'm pretty sure if we look at any index, United States 83 out of 100, Russia 13 out of 100. Pretty sure if we look at any index, U.S. press freedom is going to be bigger, is going to be greater than Russian press freedom. Western index. Dude, indexes aren't perfect. They have biases, obviously. Okay, I'm not denying that, but you don't see. I don't think there's an entire big conspiracy to say, like, I get a pretty established fact that the U.S. media is, the U.S. is a high, look at the Chinese index, India-made index. I don't think they're going to show anything that different, dude. Russia-made index. I don't know why I believe Russia-made index, but, if you link me a better index, we can look at that index, okay? But like, there are multiple different indexes like show United States freedom of press is probably better than the Russian freedom of press. Like, we know Russia arrests journalists. Like, we know Russia shuts down television stations, right? We know, yeah. Seem to only be a couple of non-US made info. I've literally qualified all my fucking statements on US made shit too, which is, it's wild to me that you think that. But again, I'm using the indexes to show why I'm skeptical of the Russian made stuff. There are, like, because the freedom of press seems to be less protected in Russia. That's why I'm more skeptical of Russian media, right? If you want to link something, you can, but you haven't linked anything. Like, you just said, "Oh, I saw on Russian TV."
Any kind of final thoughts you want to have on like how this ought to end?
One of the next day we have more freedom because ever since Biden took over the USA, we've not been free at all. Thank you, Male Rights USA. Welcome to the stream. Most indexes, like we were just looking at the Freedom House Index, say that we have more freedom than most other countries in the world. This is like very apparent. We have the First Amendment. Obviously, the US is not perfect. Look, we're lower than most Western countries even. We're at 83 versus most European countries are in the high 90s, right? Ukraine's in 49 too. No one is saying we're perfect. No one is saying that we're like great or anything. It's just that we seem to be considerably higher than Russia. Like, it's civil liberties and freedom of press, Israel in green. Like, there are problems in Israel, obviously. That's why, by the way, 74, they're even lower than us, dude. But, like, freedom of press is generally protected in Israel. Do we disagree with that? Yeah, bro, Israel's a democracy. I am gonna become the Joker, dude. I'm gonna become the Joker. Oh my god. Israel, freedom, and democracy are a spectrum. I think Lebanon and Yemen are better. Not a closed Al Jazeera. That's true, okay? This is why it's a spectrum, okay? First of all, Israel did allow Al Jazeera to operate for how many ever years before they did raid them. They did raid them. I don't think it was necessarily a good thing that they raided them. However, Al Jazeera itself, by the way, is a state-owned, it's a Qatar state-funded media agency. So, there's that. But Dameron got a kick chatter? Yeah, he's my one and only kick chatter. Thank you, man. He comes in and kicks from time to time. I appreciate him. Do you know who else banned Al Jazeera? I don't know. I'm assuming a few different places have. But again, this is a Saudi UAE. This is a freedom and democracy and freedom of press are a spectrum, okay? It's a spectrum from free to not free, okay? That's why we have things like indexes which weigh these things. The Freedom House Index is probably doesn't take into account it probably doesn't take into account the most recent raid on Al Jazeera, but these indexes take into account things like that. Things like restrictions on look, do various segments of the population, including ethnic, racial, religious, LGBTQ, whatever, have full political rights and electoral opportunities. 2 out of 4. These indexes take into account concerns over the way Arab Israelis are treated in Israel proper and the way Palestinians are treated in the West Bank. It takes into account any restrictions that the Israeli government has on media. Like, that's why we look at indexes for these things. like I don't know. If you have a better index, link it, and we can compare them, okay? But you haven't done anything. I've so heavily qualified. These indexes aren't perfect. They may have their own biases. That's why you should look at multiple indexes and again, look, 74 compared to like all these other countries that are way higher, because Israel does have issues. Israel has a lot of issues, okay? That's why they're lower than the other countries. I'm gonna become the Joker, dude.
And like, from your perspective to Vaush's question, what do we do now?
Sure. Okay. Well, first of all, I would just say that I don't think Ukraine has been very
Israel's like Taiwan and Middle East. True.
responsible throughout this whole thing, and certainly when their missile.
I just can't take it seriously. Israel sends Arab Israelis for watching wrong content, let alone making it. They scored low on the how well are racial and ethnic groups treated. Like these indexes take things into account. That's why. These things can be okay. Two things can be true at once. One, Israel has a lot of issues with the way Arab Israelis are treated in Israel proper, and the way Palestinians are treated in the West Bank. That's why indexes are a joke. You realize these indexes gave Israel a lower score because of these issues, right? I'm gonna become the Joker. I'm gonna, dude. An index takes into account all these things and gives the countries like a generalized score. Okay, it's a spectrum. It like that's the point of these indexes, is that they index multiple things. I'm gonna become the Joker. I'm gonna jump off a building. I'm gonna do it. You guys are driving me insane. I'm gonna go insane. Bro, wake up. Your index says West good, East bad. That's I'm gonna become the Joker. I'm gonna jump off a bridge, dude. Okay. The reason why it rates like Israel higher than a lot of other places is that at the end of the day, Israel has elections, okay? Israel has elections. Even the Arab Israelis are allowed to vote in these elections, and they are allowed to elect members to the Knesset. It has a proportional representation system, which allows the Arab Israelis to vote elections. What do you think is more free? Having elections or not having elections? It's a spectrum. I'm gonna come to Joker. I'm gonna shoot. Dude, okay, no, we're done. We're done with this. Nope, we're moving on. Well, America's the best country in the world. Of course, we will index high in all these things. USA runs fake elections. The reason the US has a lower score than most European countries on the index is because of these concerns. It's because of concerns over all these things, over fucking like how like Citizens United and super PACs and how inequality affects our elections. That's why the US is 83 and Norway is fucking 99. Okay, Jesus, I'm gonna shoot myself. Chat. Can't expect smart Americans to believe that. It's not meta, bruh. America has lower numbers than their strategic allies. Think it's the same shit. All I'm trying to prove is that these indexes take into account all these concerns you have. I'll pull up an index that says like Israel leans democratic, and then you're like, well, what about this, bro? The index takes those things into account, and then election was not fake. Dems just cheated. They used ballot dumps and mail-ins. What? It was not fake. Dems just cheated. I think saying Dems cheated. Finland has the highest suicide rates and the most ISIS fighters, but somehow it's happiest. Don't take these indexes seriously. Happiness is one of the hardest things to measure. Okay, now Biden has bombed the debate. I'm happy because we need Trump for more years. Okay, thank you, Mail Rights USA. Germany outscores. Yeah, I don't. God damn it, we need to fucking bring back patriotism. What the fuck?
Immediately called for preemptive attacks on Russia by the West, either lying through his teeth and claiming it was Russia who attacked Poland, or being so clueless that he hadn't even done any investigation to figure out whether it was them or not. Either way, it seems pretty irresponsible to me. But look, without even going back into ancient history, like just going back to very recent history, it was Jens Stoltenberg. I apologize to the Norwegians. I know I'm butchering that.
That was offensive.
He gave the whole game away last year. But he admitted that Vladimir Putin actually sent them a draft treaty and said, if you just promise to not bring Ukraine into NATO, I won't invade. And he brags that they said, no, we won't sign that. Haha, you didn't want NATO expansion. And look at you now. You're getting more NATO expansion. It's like, yeah, and hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. Like, could we at least
libertarian is anarchist
all agree that we should have just signed that treaty? Why is it of vital strategic interest to the United States of America that we have a war guarantee with Ukraine? Like, what? How many people in America? It's like George Kennan said back in the first round of NATO expansion. We have neither the political will nor the resources to actually defend these countries. How many people in America actually would be willing to sacrifice themselves or their children to make sure that the Donbass region is ruled by Kiev? Would you guys be willing to sacrifice your kids for that?
Ridiculous.
Anyone here?
The average American wouldn't sacrifice their lives to protect East Germany or Poland either. Do you think the average American would fight for Warsaw? This rhetoric sounds convincing, but it's empty rhetoric. Likewise, you're still not talking about what you want to say. No, explain to me what you want today to minimize. I keep talking about today, and then you keep talking about NATO. We know. I addressed and acknowledged and agreed with Western Americans.
Well, listen, Vaush, you're interrupting me.
No right to make sure that Ukraine is not in NATO. True. What base take? What from Male Rights USA there? What? So because of NATO, Nazis, or separatists can't get their narrative right. We Russians would love Trump to stop supporting clown Zelensky.
And then claiming I'm not addressing something. So first I was just saying, could we at least all agree that a couple years ago we should have just signed that deal and committed to not bringing Ukraine into NATO and avoided this war?
Couldn't Russia have just invaded anyway?
Huh?
Couldn't Russia have just invaded anyway?
Sure. I guess in the worst case scenario, it would be as bad as
maybe.
That's not. You're laughing, but there's no point to that. Yes.
Any definition of freedom for the country where you can get jail time for insulting gang rapists who themselves 0 jail time for raping teenage girls and talks to ban one major party. No one's saying, oh my god, you're talking about Germany, right? I like did not think the indexes take these things into consideration. Okay, not every index is perfect. It's just, oh my god, it's just like what do you think? Do you think in general, who has better freedom of press, Germany or Russia? What in general? Just make a generalization. That's what the indexes are here for. The index is just trash. Then link a better index. No one has linked a better index. Okay, there are multiple indexes. You should probably look at multiple. You can look at the Economist Democracy Index as well. Okay, look at all these indexes. Look at their methodology. See where countries do good and bad, and then Didn't America also hated bombs in Cuba? True. They talked about that earlier. Why is it okay now do you think the Bay of Pigs invasion was okay? Because I'm against the Bay of Pigs invasion.
Yes, in the worst case scenario, we could have still...
I would agree by most common definition of freedom. US is probably more free than Russia. Okay, wow, thank God. Wow, we got there. We got there, guys. Woohoo.
Let's talk about what we can
okay, let me please... Okay, Vaush, let me just make my point instead of this constant interrupting. Listen, yes, in the worst case scenario, I suppose it could have gone as bad as it did in this scenario, but obviously the overwhelming odds are that it wouldn't have come to this. Now, in terms of your point of saying like, well, the average American isn't willing to go die for Germany or Poland.
Why was RT News banned? Dude, why are so many fucking outlets banned in Russia? Who do you think bans more media outlets more frequently? Do you think it's the US or Russia? By the way, I don't even think that Twitch Center for Brain. R1 ban. Is that even... What do you mean ban? I think Ukraine banned Russian media outlets. Did we ever... IT banned... Did we ever... what did we ban? This was banned. And then what else did you say we banned? R1 ban. What? I don't know, but like any American has a can go watch Russian television if they want to. Like it's available. We banned the. Did you say we banned another one too? Oh, Sputnik. I haven't heard of this one. I've heard of the RT ban, but Sputnik News. Oh, is this even banned, dude? Oh, you mean removed from YouTube? It's not illegal to watch? Yeah, I think we like any of these things. I don't think it's illegal to watch. I think we stopped allowing some of them on public channels, right? And then and then I think individual companies have banned. Like I think after the sanctions, when the US banned it, what the hell? I think individual companies have banned Russian news, which it's not allowed to watch. Equals not banned. What do you mean not allowed to watch? Do you think if YouTube YouTube bans a Russian media network, do you think that's equivalent to Russia literally shutting down? Not allowed to watch it. Dude. The mental gymnastics here. What mental gymnastics am I doing? Bro, I'm gonna become the Joker. There's no prosecution in the US for watching foreign media. True. On God. We just not allowed to play at the Olympics. We are not banned. What? He's not, dude. I'm gonna become the. Okay. Any American can go out and watch Russian media if they want to. I think this was banned. I'm pretty sure this was banned from public news channels, right? Okay, what was this banned from? I don't remember, honestly. Blah, 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 blah. Blocking the English from international airwaves and social media platforms. Blah blah blah. Okay. What do we actually ban it from? Because like I can go to Sputnik News and watch it. Or I Syria argument for Russian bot. I'm probably arguing for Russian bot. Probably am, bro. Not fun. Just accept you're wrong. True. Okay, what's it better? Just keep going. Thank you. Wow, we agreed. Hold on. What are we? I don't know what we're arguing about anymore. What are we? We're still. Are we still on the index shit? We're still just fighting over whether or not these indexes. All right, great. I'm sure if you go to these indexes, they probably take into account that the U.S. has banned networks before, right? Blind a majority and no savvy technically over Russian POV. It's not banned. What do you mean by banned? Okay, I literally used the terminology banned, didn't I? I just said. I think the argument is that there isn't prosecute. It's not banning the same way that Russia bans these. Dude, I wish I had the. I should remember because I watched a fucking. Fuck. What was the name of it? Well, there was a TV channel owned by the oligarchs that I think Russia nationalized. Fuck. Russia nationalized TV channel. I wish I remember the name of it. It was before the. Before the invasion, it was like not fun to even have 120 words per minute now. YouTubers owned by here who American oligarchs. I'm gonna jump off a bridge if you guys actually can't tell it. Dude, first of all, also, they were owned by the oligarchs and then Russia nationalized them. They took them from the oligarchs. I'm gonna jump off a bridge. If you guys literally, you can't fathom, bro is a bot. Bro probably is a bot. It's so hard for me. They can't fathom what I'm saying. Okay. All I'm saying is, in general, the U.S. tends to have a freer press in Russia, and when we have press restrictions, they tend to be in a different way than Russia. Russian. It does not. You're just wrong. I don't have to tell you. You're wrong. In what way do we not have a freer press in Russia? In general.
Okay, but so why are we adding more of these countries, especially when our own intelligence community?
You've just been in this Western media bubble for bro. I'm gonna become. Just admit it. Admit what? What? Manufacturing consent. I've read this book. I read the thing. Look, it's highlighted. I read it. I read manufacturing consent. I watched it. State and Revolution. I've read this, bro. I read Lenin. I haven't read this one. Hold on, it's a bad example because I haven't read it. Targeting Iran, retargeting Iran. Two other Chomsky books. Okay, this is Western bubble to you. This is a Western bubble. I haven't read that much of this one. On Palestine, Gaza in crisis. Okay, you missed it. It was the unhighlighted line. Imperialism to stage of capitalism. Okay, look, this is highlighted too. Not that much of it is highlighted. There's sticky notes though. Sticky notes, you see the little highlighted section there? Highlighted. Peter Conquest of Bread. Lefty shit, bro. Dude, I've read this multiple times, actually. I don't like there's highlights in here, but there are a few parts underlined. Well, let me find a part that's underlined just so I can prove to you. I don't know if I'll be able to find one. I'll find one eventually, but. God damn. Oh, there we go. Here's one. Boom. Right there. Small little annotation. Okay. Woohoo. Understanding Power. Noam Chomsky. Read this whole book. I read. It's a 400-page book. Look, it's highlighted. There's highlights. There's highlights and shit. Just watch some Russian and Chinese media subtitled. You'll understand. Can you speak Russian? No, I can't speak Russian. I don't think I need to speak Russian. Okay, let me put the books away. Okay, I'm gonna become the Gonna look at the Joker. Gonna do it. I'm gonna jump over a bridge. I'm wild. My stream deck is not working for some reason. Okay, I'm going insane.
He is telling us that the risk of adding this other nation that Americans care about even less, the risk of it could result in this war, very explicitly, blatantly saying that. Now, look, again, I do think I actually answered this question pretty clearly, pretty early on in this. But right now, what we should do, being educated by what's happened in the very recent past, is to go, hey, America is going to announce that we will pull all of our support for Ukraine in this war under the condition that Vladimir Putin accepts some type of peace proposal. That's going to look like not quite as good as Ukraine would have gotten if they had taken the deal that Boris Johnson broke up, but it's going to look like Vladimir Putin obviously keeping Crimea, obviously keeping some of the territories that he already has control of, and in exchange for him ending the war, we promise that Ukraine will not be admitted into NATO.
Okay,
so that deal is still possible. Listen, let me just add one final point to this, and then you can respond however you want. Understand something here. The United States of America holds all of the chips. We could offer Vladimir Putin something that would probably get him to do whatever we wanted him to do. And you know what that is, the ultimate crowning jewel for him. How about we leave NATO? If you end this war right now, America will withdraw from NATO. Why not? Listen,
this is like silly internet rhetoric.
That's a really dumb point. How about we leave NATO? If you put on a voting, if you put voting on Ukraine-controlled areas by Zelensky, you will see that people don't want this war anymore. I think the public support for the war it's obviously dipped as the war is continuing to go on, but I'm pretty sure it's still around 60%. Last time I checked, at least.
No, it's not. It's not.
We're going to leave NATO. No, this is like for Twitter.
Who is this guy? Third left to right? Dave Smith. This is Dave Smith. This is Ryan Grimm, Vaush, Dave Smith, and I forget her name. All right, it's not Emma, whoever from the Majority Report. It's Emily something. Thank you. He's very smart.
Stuff like that.
You know.
Like, literally, the former president asked the question.
What if we left the key military alliance on the planet to incentivize a despot on the other side of the world to not invade the country they unjustly invaded?
It's such nonsense.
Listen, no. It's ginned up. It's good for Twitter likes. It's great for the ultra libertarians who are all keenly interested in Yanukovych's electoral legitimacy. It's not reality. You suggested that we offer to pull their support from Ukraine in exchange for a peace deal. Okay, fine. So let's finally talk about that then. What happens then if that divestment occurs? Naturally, there's a DMZ. Of course, there would be, right? And then you have a buildup of the remaining Ukrainian troops and Russia's troops on both sides. Don't you think it's likely that given a peace deal that takes place under those circumstances, eventually the conflict would spark again? And this time, what are we going to do? Provide aid to Ukraine again when Russia invades again?
There's the alternate rolling conflict, the ongoing slog for another couple of years. I mean,
we need to find the path through that allows the peace deal to take place in a way that doesn't guarantee an immediate future conflict. So, if we pursue an unjust peace that is immediately broken, it will have been for nothing, and we'll be in a worse position than we were before because nobody's going to want to stop the second version of the conflict 5 days after it starts. We need to be careful with this.
So first of all, let me just say that
and then Vaush will close with a response from you.
Okay, so I think that Vaush's response.
They said a lot of Ukrainians thought that they were going to regain most of the territory. Doesn't actually have support for the war. Ukraine is winning. Oh, Ukraine should fight. Yeah, 60%. Dang, I was right, bro. This is 40% though for the younger people. Well, this is until it liberates all of its 1991 borders. So the support for the war in general is going to be higher than that. Support for distant areas end the war. Russia draws troops from all occupied territories. 96%. Ukraine agrees to never strike territories. Ukraine agrees never to have nuclear option. Blah, blah, blah. Okay. Little support for elections. Elections are definitely on hold. Martial law remains in place. 63% were at least somewhat satisfied with his performance as president. Support for him is unquestionably lower than it was in the initial stage of the war. Yeah, about 60%. Anyway.
Of this is just what internet libertarians care about or something like that. I just think there was a lot of words without you actually saying anything there. NATO was created after World War II because we had the Soviet Union controlling half of Europe and Western Europe had been destroyed. It was in utter ruins. And so we felt like we had to subsidize the defense of Western Europe to make sure that this very clearly expansionist power, the Soviet Union, didn't expand into Western Europe. At this point today, Western Europe is rich and we are $34 trillion in debt. It makes absolutely no sense. And by the way, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. There is no reason for NATO to exist. There's no reason for the US to be a part of it. The former
no reason for NATO to exist. But I mean, he's going to say NATO provoked the Ukraine invasion, but a major European country was just invaded by Russia.
President of the United States
And NATO has been useful for like the no-fly zones in Libya and parts of the global war on terror.
of America, and the current frontrunner to be president of the United States of America again has made this point many, many times. This is not just something for internet libertarians to be interested in. This is something that should be a serious conversation amongst the American people. And by the way, during the fall, when the Soviet Union collapsed, there were many of the wisest graybeards in the American security establishment who felt the same way, who felt that, okay, the mission of NATO is over. Anyway, to your next point, again, this is just an empty argument. You could say this about any peace deal. Well, what if war breaks out again? Well, okay, but if your worst case scenario is war breaks out, your solution is to continue supporting the war? We want to continue the war because we're afraid of war? Listen, if we actually, as I just mentioned, which is a serious proposal, we have the ultimate chip here. We have the chip that could allow Vladimir Putin to claim, hey, I won. I stood, which is what you want in these situations. You want to let everyone save face. You want to allow the Ukrainians to say, hey, we fought and we kept this part of our territory. You want to allow the Russians to say, hey, we were pushed into this, but we were victorious. You want to let everybody save face and come up with some type of deal. And yes, Vaush, you can make the point that it's never 1,000,000% guaranteed that it'll hold and another war won't break out, but it's a hell of a lot more likely than continuing the war. So the point is, you want to come up with a deal that's realistic, that could maybe hold. And I do think that America has all the leverage in the world to make that happen.
And if I may, I'll just say that, like, no, the idea of holding out for a good peace, one that actually incentivizes both parties to keep their hands off, rather than just the first peace that comes up, that is a good instinct. The idea that there is no difference between a peace deal that immediately breaks down and a war that continues until a good peace is found, there is a massive difference between these. Look at the multiple attempts at securing peace between the Ukrainians and the Russians over the 2014 invasion of the Donbass, right? Terms are set, conditions are then not met by either side, and then nothing changes, cementing a course of action that continued down 8 years until the proper invasion by Russia began. You need to find a good peace. I don't know where that path lies, which means that I don't have the convenient, simple answer of saying, what if we just divested, left NATO, and hope that Putin never invaded the remains of Ukraine again? I think that's a very easy thing to say. I think that it's good for getting up populist fervor. I think it sounds compelling. I think it would do nothing. I think it's a virtue signal. After all, America is in NATO as a formality. Many nations that are in NATO don't even meet the required 2.5% GDP military expenditure that they need to be there. NATO is just a
it's a target, right? It's not technically required. But
cementing of existing alliances. Do you think we still wouldn't go to war with the interests of, say, Britain or Germany or France? Of course we would, because we're still allies. NATO is just the framework built around it. The real, true underlying force, which is shared geopolitical interest, persists nonetheless. What would keep Putin from invading again? In my mind, it would be promises from the West, but not promises of divestment. We shouldn't just leave Ukraine weak and open to being invaded again, because again, if they just break the peace and conquer the rest of Ukraine after giving it a year or two to rearm on the Russian front, what do we get then? Well, obviously, the Ukrainian people are conquered and they are subject to a great many, violences and humiliations. But in addition to that, of course, we continue to sort of throw fuel into the fire of an expansionist empire. Putin's intentions on this are not subtle. He was invoking the borders of the Russian Empire when he began the invasion of Ukraine. I do not think there's any reason to believe that he would be sated after he made his way all the way over to Poland. What I want is real reconciliation, not just between Ukraine and Russia, but the West and Russia. Russia has been, let's be real here, a nuclear missile-ridden backwater since the end of the Soviet Union. Prostitution skyrocketed. Child sex trafficking skyrocketed after the end of the Soviet Union. Their economy in shambles. Oligarchs effectively rule the country. There are many, many Russians who don't even have indoor plumbing. I think that a promise of shared investment, the thing we never did after the end of the Cold War, and not just business investment, not just Coca-Cola opening up a factory. I mean, real. You don't want the American taxpayer spending money on Ukrainian weapons? Okay, I got a better idea for you. 3 times as much money on Russian economic, reinvestment. Give it to them to work with. Build real economic bonds. One of the reasons Taiwan hasn't been invaded yet is because China and America are so integrated economically. We don't have that with Russia. That's one of the reasons they're able to persist in spite of all the sanctions on them, because they rely on a pretty primitive oil, coal, natural gas kind of, extraction economy. I think that if we take Russia seriously as a foreign power and as a people, we invest in them and we care about them, in the long run, we could secure a better peace that both sides feel better about, and we could build a world where there is no longer any incentive for the West or for Russia to get angry at each other. And that's my hope, naive it may be.
And probably cheaper if we just reached a peace deal and lifted the sanctions and then kept dollar hegemony.
But anyway. Well, this is a good place to leave it. And this has been super, super interesting. Thank you guys both for being game to talk some of this out. We really appreciate it. Vaush and Dave.
Okay.
Smith.
I mean, I think Vaush probably could have done better, but we're debating for policy, not Asian consent. I obviously don't agree with Dave Smith, dude. So I don't know what it is about the Ukraine stuff that turns people into mind-numbingly dumb people. Oh my god, some of those takes were making me become the Joker, dude. Oh my god. Obviously, the freedom of press in America is not perfect. Okay, I never claimed as such. Obviously, an index is not perfect. Wanting the war to end is dumb. I was talking about the other dumb takes, not the wanting the war to end. But oh my god.